Hello, and welcome to today's event hosted by Navigate Response, entitled Titanic, What If She Sank Today in 2021. My name is Tom Adams from Navigate Response, and I'm very pleased today to be able to introduce our panel of cross-industry experts for today's counterfactual discussion. It has been 109 years since the most famous maritime casualty of all time. But sadly, obviously, large-scale passenger casualties have not been consigned wholly to the past. So today we've assembled a team to talk through the various elements of responding to an incident, the size and scale of the Titanic in 2021, and talk a little bit about what would be different in today's world. So I'm very pleased to be joined by David Jardine-Smith from the International Maritime Rescue Federation, Yorgos Hatzimanolis from Marine Traffic, Dustin Eno from Navigate Response, Richard Turner from the International Union of Marine Insurance, and Genevieve Holloway from the UK P&I Club. For all of you who are joining us live today, you'll see on the right-hand side that there is a chat box. Please do interact with our panel. We want loads of questions. We've had lots of questions come in prior to the event. We've had lots and lots of interest from the expertise of our panel. But do address your questions in there, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. We hope to leave about 20 minutes at the end for questions. Do also, of course, tag us on social media. If you want to tweet about today's discussion, if you want to find us on LinkedIn, all of the organisations that are represented here today, of course, you can find them there and do kind of generate some interest in what we're discussing today. In terms of, we'll invite David Jardine-Smith on to talk about the rescue side of the Titanic operations, which of course is the piece that attracts most attention. But to briefly introduce David is a leading expert on mass rescue operations. So he worked in search and rescue for the UK Maritime and Coast Guard Agency for 25 years and for IMRF for another 10 years. He led the IMRF's mass rescue operations project and also contributed to the IMO and ICAO's review of their mass rescue guidance in the International Aeronautical and Maritime Search and Rescue Manual. So we can't really have anyone more qualified to talk about issues today. So over to you, David.
Thank you, Tom. Hello, everybody. I'm not quite sure I can live up to that welcome, but we'll do our best. I've been asked to speak briefly about the SOLAS Convention and maritime mass rescue operations. We're obviously talking about the Royal Mail ship Titanic, RMS Titanic. Just to set the scene or remind everyone, she struck her iceberg just before midnight ship's time on the 14th of April, sank in the early hours of the 15th. The numbers aren't quite clear, not quite certain, but about 2,220 people were aboard the vessel, of whom more than 1,500 died. That caused shock around the world. She was a modern vessel on her maiden voyage, built to the standards of the day, indeed slightly above the standards of the day. There was an international outcry, a number of inquiries, and a demand for improvements. That led in 1914 to the first maritime treaty, the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, the SOLAS Convention, which of course is still with us. In time, the International Maritime Organization developed as part of the United Nations. The first job it undertook, indeed, was the fourth review of the SOLAS Convention. Ships, passenger ships in particular, have been getting bigger, as we all know. This is one of the Genesis project vessels coming into harbour astern of the Titanic. In the early years of this century, the IMO undertook a comprehensive review of passenger ship safety with this increase in size in mind. SOLAS had been greatly updated over the intervening period, but it was thought by the IMO that it was time to look again at the regulations and the guidance to make sure they were up to scratch. Shortly afterwards, the International Maritime Rescue Federation, the IMRF, began their Maritime Mass Rescue Operations project. The IMRF is a representative body of the world's search and rescue organizations, principally, of course, maritime search and rescue organizations, all of whom, without exception, are worried by the prospect of a vessel of the size of a modern cruise ship getting into trouble at sea. And what would the response be? Because, as Tom said in his introduction, accidents do continue to happen. Costa Concordia, of course, almost exactly 100 years after the Titanic disaster, just about twice as many people aboard. Only 32 died, 32 too many, of course, but far fewer than on Titanic. There was an element of luck involved there. The ship eventually ended up on that rock shelf off the island of Giglio, didn't completely capsize. There was a very good response on board by junior staff. Can't be said the same for the senior staff, but the junior staff responded very well, got just about everybody off, and it was a short passage to the nearest, well, the harbour in Giglio, which can be just sighted in that aerial photograph at the bottom of the screen. Accidents still happen, that's the point. They are very rare, but they can be, or will be, involving a passenger ship, they will be extremely challenging. There's a bit of jargon, just to make sure all clear. Rescue, as defined by IMO and the International Civil Aviation Organization, is not just picking people out of the water. It does include looking after them while they're being transported to a place of safety. And a place of safety is defined in the IMSAR manual. It's basically a place where all their needs, all the survivors' needs, can be taken care of thereafter. Usually somewhere on land, of course. In the case of the Costa Concordia, Giglio, the island, was not a place of safety because it was far too small, the resources weren't there, and really it was only when people were transferred to the mainland that that rescue was completed. A mass rescue operation is also defined. You see the definition there. And basically, it comes down to being over and above what can normally be handled by the search and rescue organizations locally. It doesn't mean it's impossible to handle. It just means that it has to be done in a way that involves extra capabilities. There is, in essence, a capability gap, which has to be filled, of course, at the time. The IMRF's project produced guidance, and as Tom remarked, we were involved in updating the IMSAR manual in this respect. Our guidance is available in various formats. It looks at planning for these sort of operations. It looks for how you can identify the additional resources required. It looks at the tricky questions of command, control and coordination, bringing together not just the usual, if I can use that word, search and rescue organizations, but other organizations too, shipping companies, port authorities, land-based emergency services, immigration services, and a raft of different organizations who may not be used to working together, but do have to, of course, in the event of an accident such as this. Communications is vital. Good communications at the time to control what's going on, to keep everyone informed. Good communications afterwards to share lessons that can be learned, but primarily communications before such an event so that everybody knows who to talk to and what to talk to them about. That all involves training, testing and learning, both from actual incidents and from exercises and training regimes. So to conclude really, what if she sank today is the question we're considering. Well, hopefully we'll have somebody like this chap available. There's always an element of luck in these operations. In the case of the Titanic, I think we can sum up some of the luck as being embodied by Captain Arthur Westron here, who was the commander of RMS Carpathia, the vessel that picked up, or one of the vessels that picked up the distress call from Titanic and steamed full pelt to their assistance and picked up the survivors. I say he's the right man in almost the right place at the right time because he was very, very well organized. By the time the vessel arrived, she was ready to rescue. She conducted the rescue very well. It's not an easy job. And one of the things that's changed perhaps today, it's become slightly more difficult. Ships have got bigger. In many cases, crews have got much smaller. Using a ship to rescue people at sea beyond the range of dedicated search and rescue resources is a difficult process. In some ways, more difficult than it was for the master of the Carpathia there. What we know about these operations is that they are low likelihood, but very high consequence. Low likelihood, of course, is a good thing. We don't want these sort of things to happen, of course. There is one negative side to that, is that we can't be prepared for them, wholly prepared for them, in the sense of having all the resources on hand ready to respond, or indeed acquiring the experience. Many search and rescue professionals will go through their entire career without any incident of this sort involving them. But they have to be ready, they have to be prepared, both in terms of their training and the equipment they have to use. In general terms, those responding, the different organizations at all different levels, have to be prepared to fill that capability gap referred to in the definition of a mass rescue operation. Just because we don't normally have the resources doesn't let us off the hook. We have to find them. Very typically in maritime incidents, that will involve other shipping in the area, required under SOLAS and other conventions to help if they can. And of course, the ripple effects involving those shipping, missed schedules, sent to another port to discharge survivors, that sort of thing, is also something that has to be part of the planning. We always say that planning is actually more important than the plan itself. You can't do a detailed plan for these incidents because they are all going to be different in at least many respects, if not all respects. You don't have a detailed plan, then the important thing is to actually sit down and think, who do I need to talk to? What do I talk to them about? What resources can they bring to bear? What are their responsibilities? What do they need to know? So getting together, talking through the sort of incident that we're talking about is an extremely important function. As somebody once said, it's no good exchanging business cards at the time of the disaster. You want to do that long before. And I come back to my earlier point, really, in conclusion. Communications are key, absolutely key. We have to know who to talk to before, during, and after the incident, and make sure that, rare as they are, we're ready for the next one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Much appreciated. I think that line that you mentioned, that planning is more important than the plan in and of itself, is something that lots of us will be familiar with, that principle, and one that we can hold to heart. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time. I'd now like to introduce our next speaker, Manolis from Marine Traffic. Yorgos is responsible for raising brand awareness for marine traffic by ensuring maximum media exposure and social media engagement. He's a former journalist and editor with wide experience in media and shipping, and he now works closely with the world's leading news outlets to amplify the importance of ship tracking data and transparency in shipping. So over to you, Yorgos.
Thank you, Tom. Great to be here. So yeah, I was asked to speak about what would happen with ship tracking should the Titanic sink, if the Titanic were to sink today. I think if a similar incident were to happen today, what would occur would be that most of us, especially those of us that love shipping or are involved in shipping, would be glued to our phones or our desktop, following this entire incident in real time, tracking the vessel possibly on Marine Traffic or on other tracking platforms, following what's happening on Twitter, which is where most of the information usually gets shared these days, and of course following all the news outlets, as you said, so on the BBC or New York Times or Wall Street Journal, following what's happening. I think if we're going to take the recent Ever Given incident as an example, we would see that there is a really huge demand for such instant information right now. I don't think it would be any different should the Titanic to sink today. I actually believe the interest would be even greater than what the Ever Given was, due to the fact that obviously it's a passenger ship. So, I think that people would be out there looking for instant information, trying to find out what's happening, assuming the fanfare before her maiden voyage, the Titanic's maiden voyage, were to occur again today. I think it's fair to say that everyone, would be out on Marine Traffic trying to follow what's happening. And they would probably be following it from the very beginning of the journey, which I've tried to show you here on the map. And that's actually the kind of last position that we have known. Obviously, AIS didn't exist back then. And they would probably be looking into all sorts of information that they can get from vessel tracking platforms, including the flag which the vessel is registered under, previous ports of call, which, as we know for the Titanic, that list is fairly short, and also things like what kind of speed the vessel was traveling at. That all this kind of information becomes very important in such incidents, and everyone is trying to get their hands on it, from maritime enthusiasts right up to the journalists that are covering the stories. I think other things, AIS and, given that AIS and live tracking applications weren't available back then, but the mass interest and fascination was. So the only difference now is with technology, you can get all this information much faster. And that's, the interest, as I said earlier, is great. And we saw that again with the Ever Given, where we had in the fortnight since it happened, we had about 27 million page views on the Ever Given, which is quite staggering. I think for the Titanic it would probably be much more than that, given that, again, as I said, there would be passengers on board. We had approximately, we're still getting 170,000 page views on the Ever Given, 3 weeks later. So again, there would be a lot of interest in there, and then that interest kind of translates to social media and to the media. So we as Marine Traffic, we were extremely active on Twitter, where we saw about a 2,500% spike in engagement, and we saw that all sorts of people, were coming onto Twitter to track what was happening. So it's not just maritime professionals, it's not just P&I clubs, insurance, safety rescue, but it's also maritime enthusiasts, hobbyists, people that ship spot and take photos. Everyone wanted to see what was happening with the Ever Given. It would be the exact same thing if it happened with the Titanic. I would probably say there'd be a great deal of interest in what ships are around, which, of course, that part of the world is a lot busier now than what it was then with Marine Traffic. If you just log on to the actual app Marine Traffic, you will notice that that part of the world is full of cargo ships, lots of tankers sailing by. So hopefully that they would have been able to assist with the rescue as well. But there would be a great deal of interest in what vessels are around. Like I said, a lot of people using the app. Our app downloads during that period, skyrocketed. I think we had something like 270,000 downloads in the week around the Ever Given, and so I believe it was about 130,000 on iOS and another 140,000 on the Android, and that just shows you again just how much interest there is in information, and how lucky we are to have AIS now, which would have played a big role, if an incident like this is to happen again, because as you said earlier, it's important to get the right information out. It's important to be effective with the communication, but it's also very important to be transparent, and AIS allows us to do so. It also allows journalists to report the facts, which, going back to the Titanic, didn't exactly happen. The initial reporting was wrong, but with AIS, it's very hard to hide. You have to be open and honest about what's happening. But I'll let Dustin speak more about that, who's coming up next. So that's it from me.
Yorgos, thank you very much for that. I think your point is bang on, isn't it? It's that idea that AIS tracking, just day to day, often there's this perception that it's just marine anoraks or people who need it for operational purposes. But when there is a high profile incident like this, I mean, tens of millions of page hits to have a look at. And I know that Marine Traffic does a great job on search engine optimization, and that you know, if you Google any given vessel, you're in the top sort of five hits on there. So as you say, very important. Thanks very much for that. I'd like to now pass over to Dustin Eno. So Dustin is a colleague of mine, and he's a crisis communications and media management specialist focused on the maritime sector. He coordinates the operations of Navigate Response's global network of 45 offices, and leads Navigate's crisis communication team, which responds to over 200 incidents a year. So Dustin, over to you.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Tom. I saw this artist rendering a couple of years ago on social media, and it stuck with me. And I posed the question to you: is this actually what would happen? Would we actually see passengers as they were evacuated, perhaps not from the water, but from the lifeboats, etc., filming with their phones and recording? Or would we see people be a little bit more responsible and perhaps focused on the situation? Sadly, the conclusion I have to come to is yes, this is fairly accurate. From the Costa Concordia to more recent incidents with the storm and the evacuation involving the Viking Sky and numerous other cases, we have seen mobile phone footage emerge from the passengers almost immediately. And it's not just limited to ocean-going incidents, it's also airline incidents. This is an image from a couple of years ago. It was taken by a passenger on board a plane that had crash landed in the Middle East. The plane was clearly filling with smoke here, and what we see is this individual has taken the time to pull out his phone and take a picture. We also notice that people have opened the overhead bins to get their belongings before heading to the evacuation slides. In an incident, we have to assume that not all people will behave in the way we might hope that they would. So how do we respond in a communication standpoint? Navigate Response is a crisis communications firm specializing in the maritime sector. We deal with both passenger incidents and cargo incidents. And it's our job to help try and figure out how should a company effectively communicate. The challenges that faced the Titanic were in some ways very different and in some ways similar. One thing that they didn't have to worry about was onboard internet connection, obviously. But that is a question that faces modern passenger vessel operators. Should you leave the Wi-Fi on or not? On the plus, leaving it on keeps the passengers happy. It allows that chance if passengers are going to perish, and again, we must always hope that they won't, but if they are, it allows them the possibility of sending that one last message to family or a loved one, and that can make a big difference to the grieving process. It also creates a public record of what people did, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. But in terms of future investigations, in terms of legal proceedings potentially, we can have that public record of what people were actually doing involved. So there are advantages to letting information out and leaving that Wi-Fi on. On the negative side, it will almost certainly lead to greater public panic, both on the vessel and off the vessel, because you're going to have information coming out without any form of context at all. Anything, whether it's the announcement that the captain makes that's recorded by people on their mobile phones and streamed live, or anything else happening, is going to come out in bits without context, without explanation. So it needs to be considered carefully. But if the incident happens close to land, and of course that wasn't the case for the Titanic, but has been the case for numerous other incidents that I'm showing here on the screen, you have no choice. Even if you turn off the Wi-Fi, people will be speaking about it. And just to focus on one example, the most recent example here that I've got up, the Diamond Princess, which was one of the first sort of major focuses of the COVID-19 pandemic over a year ago now. The passengers were quarantined on board, but they all had their mobile phones, and it became a media circus in part because those passengers were able to broadcast everything that was happening, everything that was being said by the master and the crew, drew a lot of attention, and in some ways was a positive, and in some ways a negative. Also, don't forget about the other vessels. Any vessel that comes to the rescue, and again, we obviously hope and expect that they would, but any vessel that shows up can take a picture. This picture, which was one of the most circulated pictures a few weeks ago, was taken by a crew member, posted on Instagram from another ship. And we would have to expect the same in any mass rescue situation. Now, let me turn away for a second from social media, because of course social media didn't exist at all at the time, but the news media very much did, and print news was king at that time. Print news didn't get it right in the early stages. There were numerous reports that the Titanic had had an incident, but it was widely reported that the Titanic was safe, that the crew and passengers had all been evacuated, that everyone was completely safe, that everyone had been transferred to lifeboats, and indeed that the Titanic was under tow and headed for Halifax. That was not true. And sadly, this sort of slight misreporting is something we deal with all the time. And it's not really the fault of journalists or anyone else. It's that challenge of getting good information during an incident that can be challenging even for the companies involved. Getting that information correct makes a huge difference to what we're able to communicate. And I'll come to one of the challenges that White Star Line faced in just a second. Of course, eventually the news did break more accurately, and eventually the news did come out that indeed there had been a mass casualty event. There were numerous, that a lot of people had died. But that didn't happen until, 36 hours later. There was a significant time delay. And that, of course, is one of the big differences we would see today. It would be unthinkable to wait 36 hours before we had accurate reporting. We sometimes say of breaking news now that they are never wrong for long, which is to say they very often get the details wrong at the beginning, but they'll quickly get it right, much more quickly than happened at this time. I mentioned that challenge that White Star Line had. Now, this is a quote from April 16th, so just a day after the incident. This is the 36 hours on. This is from United Press International's archives. Speaking of White Star, they say, White Star admitted that they had known for some hours before they made public announcements that the Titanic had foundered, but they waited until they had confirmed reports from the Olympic, which is one of the vessels that came to her rescue. Was that the right choice? It's a struggle that would be faced by any communications or senior leadership executive today. At what point do you make the announcement that the vessel has sunk? At what point do you make the announcement that people have died? Go too early, and you'll be condemned if you get it wrong for creating panic. Go too late, and you're going to end up in a situation where people blame you for not having communicated early, not having communicated as quickly as might have been expected. It's a difficult balance that was exactly the same then as it would be today. And one other difference I want to draw attention to is the international element. Titanic sinking was covered around the world, but it was not front page news really anywhere other than Europe and North America. This is a back page in the Sydney Morning Herald where it was covered, but it wasn't a significant story. Now we have a much more international travel base, and this is a case from the South Atlantic from 2015, where the story wasn't big news anywhere around the South Atlantic, not Argentina or the Falkland Islands, but it was massive news in China because that's where the passengers were from. So communications has become far more international. And finally, of course, Titanic has left an indelible mark on our perception of shipping and shipping incidents. These are all press clippings from the Viking Sky incident of a couple of years ago, in which a number of passengers were evacuated off the coast of Norway in a storm. It was nothing like the Titanic. They didn't hit anything. It wasn't night. It was a massive storm, not a flat calm. And yet, because it was a major passenger incident, because it was scary, many, many passengers described it as being like the Titanic. So if you have an incident today, what will be different? Well, in part, it'll be different because everyone will be referring to the Titanic and thinking of it in those terms. Thanks very much. Back over to you, Tom.
Thanks very much, Dustin. Yeah, I think, that element of the injection of social media, even on top of all of the misinformation that was in the traditional media at the time now, is challenges that any exec would kind of it will keep them up at night thinking about the sort of thing that would happen there. So thanks very much. And that kind of, even though that wraps up sort of the event on the day, there's still a lot more to discuss about the Titanic. And to do that, I'd like to introduce my next two panelists. But first of all, I'd like to introduce Richard Turner. Richard's worked in insurance for 37 years, and for virtually all of that time exclusively in marine insurance. And Richard was elected president of the International Union of Marine Insurance in 2018. He's a member of IUMI's Policy Forum, Education Forum, and Data and Digitalization Forum. And with that very impressive background, Richard, I'll pass over to you.
Thank you very much, Tom. Good morning, everybody. So the Titanic, and viewed at from an insurance perspective, I want to take a few minutes first to actually take you back to 1912 and the insurance placement that was put into place before that time. The broker, as you can see, was Willis, and Willis arranged cover on not just the Titanic but her sister ship, the Olympic, as well. Her sum insured was £1 million. Which in today's money would be about 115 million. I have seen sources suggesting that she was insured for about $5 million, but actually that was roughly the exchange rate between $1 million and $5 million. It was an exchange rate of $4.80 at that time, believe it or not. It's amazing to think about that from the vantage of the year 2021. The premium charged by the market on the Titanic was 0.75%. And I'll come back to that at the end because I think there's an important point to make about the rate that was charged. The slip was open for placement on January the 9th, and she was completed inside 3 days. Underwritten by 50 Lloyd's syndicates and 12 companies, their various lines ranging between as little as £200 and as high as £75,000. It was the highest ever risk placed at Lloyd's, certainly from a marine perspective at that time. And I think it's worth, if we think about the highest ever risk analogy, I think in this day and age, we would be thinking probably a vessel worth $1 billion would be about the right context for what the Titanic would have meant to the market at that time. I have in the past picked up rumours that suggest the insurance placement wasn't fully in place, but I have to say the research I've done for this suggests otherwise. And so this is very much the information I've picked up from Lloyd's as a source. This is a copy of the insurance placement, and you can see they're ringed. If you're very eyesight is very, very good. The sum insured confirmed of £1 million. It's just interesting to see the way a slip looked like from 100 years ago. Dustin touched on the confusing communications, and there was an insurance consequence to that, because the initial reports coming out in London the morning after the sinking suggested that, did not suggest in fact that the ship had sunk, and that she was in fact in tow. And so in the very early hours of the morning of the 15th, there was a trade in what at the time, and for many years, was regularly transacted, overdue insurance. So this was where a vessel was known to be in trouble or had simply not arrived at her destination. The insurance market would engage in overdue insurance. And in the very early hours of trading on the 15th, the rates rose to 60% of value on the morning of April the 15th. Just compare that to the originally placed rate of 0.75. But then a report came in that the vessel was in fact in tow to Halifax. And at that point, the rates dropped to 25%. But of course, later on the 15th, it was confirmed that the vessel had sunk. And at that point, trading in overdue insurance came to a halt. From the perspective of the claim, the market paid the full total loss, £1 million within the space of 1 month. But of course, Hull and Machinery does not tell the whole story. Many passengers had life cover, and there was also P&I in place, and I'm sure Genevieve will touch on that in just a few moments. This is actually an artist's impression on the right of the suggested scene in Lloyd's when the Titanic sinking was confirmed. And the Lloyd's casualty book reads, and it's interestingly, it's only written up on Tuesday the 16th. Titanic, Southampton for New York, founded April 15th, about 2:20 a.m. in latitude 41 degrees north, 50 degrees west, after collision with ice, reported by wireless from Olympic, the vessel Olympic, to the Cape Race wireless station. Further reports state that loss of life is very serious. So kind of quite a pithy summary of what actually happened. When we think about it from the perspective of what if it happened now, I think this is worth addressing from two angles. The first is, what factors have largely stayed the same, at least in terms of context? And I think this is never going to be an exclusive list, but I would suggest to you the first thing that has remained and always will remain a constant is that human error remains a key risk factor in casualties, affecting in excess of 75%. I've seen figures suggesting even 90% of casualty activity. And as has already been touched on by other speakers, the Costa Concordia incident, I think, certainly bore echoes of the Titanic casualty in terms of some of the elements that led to the casualty happening, and indeed how the casualty occurred. Safety at sea has definitely improved in the last 100 years, but I would argue remains on a journey of improvement. I think one thing that is true throughout history, whether we're talking about accidents and incidents on shore or at sea, is that they tend to act as catalysts and agitators for change, for improvement. And that was certainly true of the Titanic, and we can point to much more recent incidents where that was also the case. And I think one of the interesting things about the market today is actually the insurance products that the market provides they have quite strong similarities with the insurance products that were purchased at that time. When we talk about the Titanic, the maritime insurance response was split into Hull and Machinery and P&I, and the same remains true today. I mentioned that over 60 insurers were involved in the insurance of the Titanic. Co-insurance is still very prevalent in the Hull market today. And I guess one historic note here would be just to highlight, I see many insurance entities still tracing their marine insurance history back to noting their involvement on the Titanic, and even before. And I think it's an interesting quirk of the insurance sector that there can't be too many industries that would be able to trace their history back over 100 years. And indeed, in insurance terms, marine insurance dates back 300-400 years. But of course, the other aspect of this question is, well, what is different? And the other speakers have spoken very eloquently on this, but I think there's just a few things worth drawing out. The first, of course, is that ship sizes have generally increased. Of course, not just in the passenger sector, but also in the cargo arena as well. The step changes that have occurred in technology and design, of course, have made another huge impact in this space. And there has been transformative changes in the communication space. When I first came into the market, which was in the 1980s, the awareness of insurers of what was going on with ships was probably nearer the area of when the Titanic sank than it is to today's era. Broadly speaking, marine insurance was done out of underwriting guides and using paper manuals, and the awareness of where ships were actually going and what they were doing was very, very low. So really, you only became aware of a ship's location when it actually had a casualty. Of course, today's world, you can track what ships are doing in real time. And the final point we can say here is that safety has unquestionably improved, and you can see an indication of that in the data set out here for the proportion of ships that were total losses tracked through a period of just over 100 years. So in the year 1910, just before the Titanic sank, the probability of a ship sinking was 1%. And you can see the gradual improvement there through the ages to a point where in 2019, which is the last year we have full year data available to us, the probability of a ship sinking, being a total loss, was 0.05%. And I finished there, but also in doing so, I would remind you that the Titanic was priced at a rate of 0.75. So the market at the time took the view that they would give essentially all risks cover for a rate less than the total loss probability of shipping at the time, which I think tells you something even about the psyche of underwriters about the view that there was about the potential of the Titanic to be a total loss. So I'll stop there, Tom, and pass back to you.
Wonderful, thank you, Richard. Yeah, I think that last slide is always, it's an encouraging picture. That I think there is this perception that with ships getting bigger, more passengers on board, that there's just a bigger accident waiting to happen, and it's heartening to see that total loss casualty rate exponentially decline, which of course is what we all want to see. Richard obviously mentioned in his presentation that you focused on sort of the H&M side of things, but I'd like to now kind of introduce Genevieve Holloway from the UK P&I Club. Genevieve is a senior claims executive at the UK club, specialising in people-related claims for a wide selection of the club's members. So she has a particular expertise in handling claims for the club's cruise ship members, including passenger ship casualties and cruise curtailments. And before joining her current role, Genevieve serves as deck officer on board cruise ships. So it's a proper first-hand look at some of the issues arising from the people side of things. So over to you, Genevieve.
Thanks, Tom. And I'm going to be looking at this, as you say, from the aspect of passenger litigation. And something that Dustin touched on earlier is, if an event of this nature happened today, the passengers on board would have their phones in their hand, and they may well be on the phone to their lawyers before the ship is even finished sinking. But there's a few other factors to consider also. Lawsuit seeking compensation following a cruise ship casualty is not a new thing. Many claims were brought against White Star Line from the survivors and the dependents of those who perished following the sinking of the Titanic in 1912. In total, we know that $665,000 was paid out, and that was to be shared across all plaintiffs. Today, this would be worth a little over $17 million. Now, unquestionably, this is a substantial sum of money. However, it pales into insignificance as to what would likely be paid if a similar nature of this happened today. And whilst claims for damages are not new, they're certainly more common and indeed acceptable in the claim culture that we live in today. What has changed over the past 100 years is that the process of bringing a claim is a lot more regulated. And this makes it more easy for plaintiffs to bring their claims, but it also allows ship owners a great deal more certainty. And I'm going to look at some of those factors now. Firstly, the passenger ticket. As you may expect, cruise lines have very sophisticated and tried and tested terms and conditions incorporated into every passenger ticket, regardless of how or where their cruise is sold. We're all guilty at times of not reading the small print before ticking the box to continue, and the same principles apply here. Whether read or not, the passenger is agreeing to these terms and conditions when they're booking their cruise and will later be bound by them. These terms will contain a whole host of clauses, but what's of particular importance here is that we would expect to see incorporated into every passenger ticket a time bar. Now, this imposes a time limit on the passenger, a time limit within which they must bring their legal action against the company, and that allows the ship owner a little bit of certainty that beyond this point, no further litigation will follow. Class action waivers, we would expect to see these entered into passenger tickets issued today. And by accepting the cruise line's terms, the passenger is waiving their right to participate in or bring a class action against the company. Whether or not this is upheld will depend on the jurisdiction. We know that there are certain jurisdictions, such as England and Australia, that deem such a clause as unfair and will not uphold the waiver. Conversely, however, in the US, this will be upheld and therefore class certification will not be granted. And like with any form of contract, a passenger ticket will contain a clause which details the law and jurisdiction applicable to the contract. And this will outline and limit where lawsuits can be brought. In my experience, this is generally upheld in most courts and will then be applicable to any claims brought under the contract, but also in tort. And this is important because the jurisdiction in which a claim is brought will have a significant impact on which statutes apply, and this will affect how a claim is handled and will likely have an influence on the overall value of the claim. So if we look at some of the more common jurisdictions that we see, there is an EU regulation which incorporates the Athens Convention 2002 protocol into the law of all EU member states. And this remains in force in English law post our departure from the European Union. And the Athens Convention is an international convention and it provides a uniform regime for the payment of liabilities and damages to passengers carried at sea. Article 7 of the 2002 protocol allows carriers to limit their liability for claims for death and personal injury, and that limit is set at 400,000 SDRs per passenger, which is approximately £415,000 or 570,000 US dollars. And even in the context of an extreme maritime casualty, as we saw with the Titanic, the per passenger limit can only be broken if the claimant can prove that the damage resulted from an act or omission done with intent to cause harm. So that's unlikely to be the case. Additionally, the Athens Convention still allows cruise ships to limit their overall liability. So in actual fact, when we have a very large casualty case where there are multiple claims for deaths and injuries, the amount available per person may be less. The total overall limit of liability still comes from the 1976 Convention, and this is calculated at 175,000 SDRs, which is then multiplied by the number of passengers that the ship is authorised to carry. And that total sum will provide the overall limit for all passenger claims. If we were to compare this position to what's applicable in the US, in the same way as the Athens Convention, cruise ship operators can limit their overall liability across all passenger claims as one event. And this is done under the US Limitation of Liability Act, which requires a limitation fund to be set up, which is calculated by the value of the ship. And this would be applicable still if a major event took place today. Converse to the position under the Athens Convention, however, is that no limits of liability are available for individual passenger claims under US law. And this means that we see quite high values of compensation being awarded. Another consideration for cruise lines to bear in mind is that the majority of US cases will be set before a jury, and they can be very unpredictable and lead to runaway verdicts. Another factor for US claims is that any death resulting from a negligent act which took place on board but outside of 3 nautical miles from the US coastline, the Death on the High Seas Act will apply. And damages recoverable under this act are extremely limited, as it only allows for pecuniary losses by the claimant only, such as the loss of financial support. Damages for the deceased, pre-death pain and suffering, and loss of consortium, which are likely to be an expensive part of a claim, are prohibited. Punitive or exemplary damages are damages awarded purely to punish a defendant for their outrageous conduct. And in some situations, it's used to deter the defendant or others from engaging in similar conduct in the future. Any such award would be paid in addition to compensatory damages to the plaintiff. We would expect to see these added to any lawsuits brought by passengers following a cruise ship casualty, but whether or not they will be awarded will depend on a couple of points. Firstly, the jurisdiction of the claim. Only certain jurisdictions or states within the US allow for punitive damages. And secondly, and unsurprisingly, the facts of the case. Do the circumstances of the event which took place warrant punitive damages being awarded? This may be a difficult hurdle for the plaintiffs to overcome, as in most cases, punitive damages are only awarded in cases of deliberate and calculated actions. So what about offering compensation? An immediate response from the cruise line to volunteer compensation can be helpful, but there's a few things the company should keep in mind. In cases where there's thought to be no liability on the part of the cruise line, any amounts offered should be minimal, perhaps a partial or full refund of their cruise. And to avoid the company's actions being inferred as an admission of liability, it should be made clear to the passengers that this is a gratuitous payment. Where there is any possible liability, especially in the context of an injury case, it should be made clear that any payments made will be offset from any damages awarded, were a claim to be brought by the passenger in the future. The company should keep a record of any amounts paid and, where possible, record all of this information in correspondence with the passenger. And just one final point, that when considering compensation payments to passengers, cruise lines should always consult with their P&I clubs to avoid any surprises or potential disputes over coverage of the compensation amounts paid.
Thanks, Genevieve. It's really interesting. And just, I mean, one thing that kind of strikes me there as we were listening to you is it seems sort of the passengers of the Titanic didn't actually receive kind of a great deal of compensation. Can you kind of briefly outline how damages would be assessed now for, let's say, a family claiming for someone, you know, who'd lost their life on board or something similar?
Sure. Yeah, no, you're right. It's not well documented at all to know how many claimants there were following the Titanic or who received what amount. All we know is that a lump sum was paid to the other side for them to distribute amongst the claimants. Let's say, for simplicity's sake, that around half of the passengers on board were involved in a claim of some nature, and they received an equal share of the amount paid. They would be looking to receive around $26,000, and that's taking from the 17 million value from today, not the original sum. So very little amount at all. And if we were to compare this to today, assuming liability is established, the damages awarded would not only be considerably higher, but they would vary considerably depending on the circumstances of the claimant. So, for example, if we were to take a retired person losing their spouse and they have no dependents, their claim would be far lower than, say, a person in their mid-30s with a well-paid job and a dependent wife and children. With the former, there would not be any claim for any loss of earnings, for example, but with the latter, there would be a considerable claim for loss of earnings, loss of pension, etc. And where those upper limits apply, in that sort of context, we would probably expect to see that claim capped around the 400,000 SDRs that I mentioned earlier. But if that claim was to be brought in the US where there is no limit, that claim could run into the millions.
Yeah. I mean, as you say, that different litigation angle in the US and the Death on High Seas Act is something, you know, certainly I wasn't aware of before you kind of had spoken through it. So something for everyone to bear in mind. Everyone who's kind of listening, we have over 300 people on the call. You know, do get your questions in. We've got about 10 to 15 minutes now to take questions from our panel. And actually, David, I'd like to turn to you first of all, if I may. There's a question here from Chris Chambers. Thanks very much, Chris, which asks, is there clarity around coordination of the rescue efforts and information? Has this been tested and exercised in a scenario that takes place in international waters? And if so, what lessons have been identified and learned?
Thanks, Tom, and thanks, Chris. That's a very complex set of questions, or at least it's got complex answers, and I will be as brief as possible. Can provide more if required later. In a sense, there's clarity, yes. The at-sea portion of any maritime incident is covered by the IMSAR manual that Tom referred to earlier. The whole globe is divided into search and rescue regions. We're not actually talking about territorial waters here and international waters. We're talking about search and rescue regions, which includes international waters. Each state, generally speaking, has an area of sea for which it will take responsibility for coordinating response. And those regions, for those interested, can be found in the Admiralty List of Radio Signals, Volume 5. And that state would then establish a rescue coordination centre, or more than one, and information about the incident can be provided by that coordination centre. There is a problem in that many states, developing states in particular, have very limited resources they can apply to this. They may have national priorities much greater than the just faint possibility of a ship getting into trouble in their waters. So the response is going to vary. Some states, of course, are very small. And let's take a big cruising area, the Caribbean. Most states in the Caribbean are very small states with naturally limited resources. They're all very switched on to the search and rescue requirement and their capabilities and responsibilities. But there's only a certain amount any individual state can do. And there it's a matter of mutual support and support also from the United States. So it's a mixed picture. There's also a mixed picture when you come to the on-land response, because any maritime emergencies, and then as people are brought ashore, it's handed over to the police in the UK's case. Each state will have its own national response mechanism. So there's the international element of the at sea, where we all follow the same guidelines. Ashore, there'll be different requirements, which makes life difficult for example, cruise companies. Have these things been tested? The answer is yes, to the extent that you can. Probably not sufficiently, certainly not in some parts of the world, hence my slight concern there. The question about lessons identified is a very complex one. I think I can probably say that many of the lessons identified are covered in the guidance that the IMRF have published, generalized, of course. And I can only reiterate what I said earlier. The big lesson that comes out of every incident and every exercise is that communications between responding agencies, between the ship, the company, and the responding rescue coordination center, and all the other agencies involved, communications could be improved. And that's something that can only be sorted out beforehand, really, by talking to each other. I hope that, in summary, is an answer to the question. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think that does. And Chris, of course, if you have any further questions for David, of course, we'll be able to make his information available for you. We're getting lots of questions in. You can also submit them privately as well. So we're getting a few coming in through there. Do keep them coming in. Richard, there's one here from Peter Hugler, and I'll read it out, which is, Richard, you mentioned the journey of safety at sea. I'd argue that marine insurance plays an important role here. Do you have any thoughts on the maritime insurance consequences of a Titanic scale event in the Polar Code geographical scope? I'll throw that to you.
Yeah, so I think Peter makes a good point. I think insurers do have a role to play in the journey of safe standards in that space. At the current time, as IUMI, we are agitating for improvements on container ships because, frankly, far too many of those are catching fire. And so, yeah, insurers absolutely have a role to play in this. I think as regards the Polar Code, well, as an organisation, we had an involvement in the Polar Code. We had input to it when it was established. Clearly, any shipping going into that area has concerns from our perspective. Quite frankly, because if a vessel does get into trouble, the available support and infrastructure to help that ship is going to be very much more limited, and so you have huge complexity. I can remember a passenger ship getting stuck in the Northwest Passage probably about 10-15 years ago now, as I recall, I think the passengers had to be airlifted. So it's a tricky area, and of course we absolutely understand that the de-icing of the polar area is going to create potential commercial advantages to shipping going through that space, but it needs to be undertaken with great care.
Yeah, I think that's a good. Those are all great points. We've got time for a couple of questions. I'm just going to ask this one, which we've had in, which is actually for Dustin. Which is Dustin. You mentioned that social media,
the vessel, where she is, what she was doing, and that's all incredibly helpful, except when people don't understand it. So most of the time, yes, it's very helpful. And sometimes it can be hugely misleading, not because it's wrong, although occasionally AIS data is simply incorrect. But even if it's correct, people sometimes look at it and draw certain conclusions that simply aren't correct based on the data. And so people can feel incredibly certain. They'll look at something, they'll say, well, the ship was there, she was navigating strangely, she must have done X, Y, or Z. Well, not necessarily. And so I would say it makes it easier as long as there's sufficient explanation coming from the shipping company involved or relevant authorities to help put that data in context. Otherwise, it can lead to a lot of sort of misleading conclusions.
And actually, Yorgos, I'd just ask you to comment on a similar kind of vein there in terms of what kind of requests does marine traffic get from, say, could be rescue authorities, but it could be in the aftermath of any kind of incident. Do you get requests for kind of expert witness or any kind of data that you make available? How does that kind of work on a practical basis at the minute?
We do often get requests, and we're always willing to work very closely with authorities. So we often get requests after the fact, just to verify the movements of certain vessels or vessels that were around it. So it is something that does happen, and as I said, we're always open to working closely with authorities on that. If I can just touch on Dustin's point, he really did hit the nail on the head. There are to cross-check and to speak with the appropriate people to ensure that they get the information correct. They're then relaying the wrong message out, which of course causes further problems. And one other point that I can make is that I really do believe that, a lot of, I know Dustin's doing a lot of great work with Navigate Response, but a lot of shipping companies need to become more active after such incidents and beforehand in understanding how to communicate and understanding that the information is out there. So it's better to get ahead of it rather than, kind of hide and hope that it goes away, which it will not. Explaining your side with the right information can be crucial.
Yeah, I think those are all fantastic points, and at this stage we've just crossed over the hour mark, so I kind of want to wrap up. Just first of all by just saying thank you to all of our panel who've joined us today, who've shared their thoughts. I think we've had a very holistic view of how things might be a little bit different and touched on some things that hopefully may have occurred to you and also may not have occurred to you. Of course, post the event, we will be circulating any replays. If you'd like to pass them on to colleagues, obviously please do so. And of course, if you want to get in touch with us, we'll include our contact details in that as well. With that, thank you very much from me. Thank you very much from everyone at